there are 64 hexagrams, that is to say, figures consisting of 6 lines each, varying between yang lines and yin lines, and these represent what are to the Chinese the elements of life, not just air, water, earth, and fire, but heaven and earth, fire and water, the lake and the mountain, the wind, which funnily enough is associated with wood, and electricity, or thunder. And it's so interesting that this Book of Changes is used as a book of divination. There are various methods, either by tossing coins or by making certain combinations of sticks, whereby one arrives at a given hexagram. So that in any given situation you throw the coins or cast the sticks, and that will give you what is the hexagram of this moment. Or I've seen it done by a Zen master in quite another way. He took just the bowl of flowers that somebody had arranged, and he took the groupings of the flowers in the bowl, and said, when he looked at it, to the person who put the flowers in the bowl, "Ah, yes, you were in such and such a mood at the time you did that." Now, in the Book of Changes, each hexagram is accompanied by an interpretation. But you know how oracles are. Sometimes the things they say are very specific, and sometimes the things they say are very vague, so that you can project into this vagueness, as one projects into a story or a picture onto a Rorschach blot, whatever is your feeling at the time. But the I Ching has a very peculiar quality, and it's very difficult to pin down, but it is like having a conversation with a great sage about, especially if you addressed it and turned to a particular hexagram with a specific problem in mind. You know, there is an old Western custom of opening the Bible at random and picking on a verse to see what it tells you. Bibliomancy. And but this is somewhat more complex than that, and is used by some very, very sophisticated people for making decisions. And one reason why it's effective is that making a decision firmly is better for almost all purposes than making one weakly. And also, since the information available to us about any particular decision is extraordinarily incomplete, because it does not, you just take any rational decision into consideration and think of the number of variables that might come into it that you never could conceivably have thought of. And therefore, sometimes it's enormously effective to take decisions at random. And so this raises to us a question that was implicit in all that we were discussing this morning about not interfering, so on, raises the great question of the artificial and the natural, which is absolutely central to Taoist attitudes and later on to Zen, and it lies strongly in the background of Chinese life. One might, of course, say that a distinction between the artificial and the natural is an artificial distinction, because if bees' nests are natural, so are human buildings. What then on earth do we mean by the word natural? How do the Chinese use it? How do we use it? Let's first look at how we use it. We use it in two ways. One, when we say, what is the nature of this thing? This is a later meaning. I'm really working backwards. This is a later meaning than the earlier use of the word nature. But when we ask what is the nature of this thing, we ask for its classification. Is it animal, vegetable, or mineral? and so on. So the great treatises, the early Western treatises on nature, were such works as John Scotus Erigeno's book, De Divisione Naturae, concerning the divisions of nature. And after him, books on natural history. The main thing they taught you was how to classify the various kinds of creatures. The bestiary of the Middle Ages was a classification of creatures. And so later on, our works of natural history tell you what families all the various fishes and birds and moths and butterflies and flowers and trees belong to. So the divisions of nature is the use of the word nature as kind of. That is based on the earlier meaning, which is that everything behaves according to its nature, and there are different natures. The word is connected in Latin, natura, with birth, nativity. And so the way you are born is you have a certain nature given to you by God. When God in the beginning said, God, in the poem, God to some sticky stuff, not yet alive in a hive, said, come, hum, be my bee and buzz as I bid. And sure enough, it was, and it did. Because God is supposed in the beginning to have established the nature of all things and to have laid down the laws for their behavior. So natural law lies at the basis of the Western idea of nature, because there was in the beginning a lawgiver who thought up in his mind an ideal plan for the universe. And this plan was called the Logos, or the Word, which is in Christianity the second person of the Holy Trinity. That person in the divine nature which is supposed to have been incarnate in Jesus Christ, according to Christian theology. So it is said in the creed of Christianity that one believes in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made. People don't usually punctuate that properly. And they think it's the Father by whom all things were made. No, it's not. It's the Son by whom all things were made, the Word. In other words, the law, the ideal pattern of the universe is the actual creative agent in Christian philosophy. It leads on to our idea of the law of nature as being, as it were, the supernatural rails upon which creaturely streetcars are forever to run. And so there's the whole idea, all flesh is as grass, but surely the word of the Lord abideth forever. The fixed, unalterable, unchangeable laws, like the laws of the Medes and Persians, which could never be repealed, and who were partly responsible for filtering this idea into the West. So, to act according to nature in the West means to act according to the laws which the Lord God has laid down for every particular species and every particular member of that species. But then, of course, there is the possibility of being unnatural, to break the law of nature, and to do things which you were never supposed to do. Because, you see, the West has this thought that one can be unnatural, that you can, by using an artifice, break the course and the law of nature. Now, the Chinese also have the conception of people acting in an unnatural way. And there's a long discussion of this in Zhuangzi. And he describes the pure men of old who made no plans for the future, who had who were affectionate without knowing that it was being loving, who were faithful without calling it loyalty. And he describes the way they lived and how they went about. They were never in a hurry. They just strolled around, and it was a fine life. And nobody ever had any thought. There were no police, no laws. Nobody ever talked about virtue or anything like that. When the great Tao lost, there came duty to man and right conduct. So the decisions and the planning we do might be just as well to leave it to the Tao, and so on, just as the cats and birds appear to do. Now, what is our argument against the cats and birds? We say, well, number one, because we can foretell the future and make plans, we can control our lives better than the animals and survive longer as per individual. We can live more elegantly, and we have greater control. But we pay a price for that, and the price is called anxiety. Because the more we know about the future so as to be able to control it, the more we worry about it. We can lie awake nights thinking, did I do the right thing? Did I take everything into consideration? Will it work out? And when you feel poor, for example, and you don't have enough money, and then you get enough money, and you don't have to worry about bills anymore and things like that, so you start worrying about something else. Will you get sick? Will you get involved in an accident? Will the police come after you? Anything, you know? But when you are an anxious person, you're going to be anxious about something, come what may. You're thinking ahead. Can I succeed? Now, there are people, of course, who throw all this off and say, to hell with the whole thing. I'm not going to bother anymore about all this stuff. It's very difficult to be one, incidentally, because the others who think they're so important because they're making all these plans start pushing you around. They say, come on, you've got to join our game. You can't be outside our game. Go away. Or if they put you in a jail. Well, of course, in jail, you don't have to make any plans. You don't have to make a damn decision at all. You just do what you're told. And same in a loony bin. So that's one way, but it's kind of depressing. Those places are full of, someone said the other day, gray dust. You know, the whole atmosphere is like gray dust. So that's not the answer. Some people think if we could get off into a wild place, go to the South Seas, go into the mountains somewhere, and just get out of all this thing, stop this game, and live like an animal would live in the course of nature. Taoism, in practice in China, is adopted by older men or women who say, well, all right, the young can take over in this game that we've been playing, and off they go. And there's something that they've painted up a huge romance about the old man of the mountain. One of the lovely poems called Inquiring for the Master. I asked the boy beneath the pines. He said, the master's gone alone, herb gathering somewhere on the mount, cloud hidden, whereabouts unknown. So this idea then of going back into the mountains is comparable to the thing the Hindus do when I explained, when you get through the grihastha phase of householder, you go to the vanaprastha state of being a forest dweller. It's the same idea. Only the Chinese have poetized it more than the Hindus. The poems of Hanshan, which means cold mountain, and this poet took his name from the mountain, translated by Gary Snyder in the Evergreen Review some years ago. Absolutely marvelous expressions of this going off to the floating life, to drift like a cloud and to flow like water. And so the mood of this is one of the components of what the Japanese call yugen. We have no translation for that word. But one of the components of yugen is to wander on and on in a great forest without thought of return. And so there's another Chinese poem which starts out with the line, "My thoughts shall wander in the great void." And so the man he owns nothing, and nothing owns him. Or putting it in St. Paul's phrase, to be as having nothing but possessing all things. The beggar, says a poem, he has heaven and earth for his summer clothes. So, this is carrying out the ideal of being natural in a very, very literal sort of way. Actually going back to the forest. Actually giving up concern about what you shall eat and what you shall drink and wherewithal you shall be clothed, the most subversive and supposedly impractical passage in the Bible. But of course, given a certain toughness of muscle and hardiness of health, this can be done by any human being. Because, after all, if you live that way and stop planning and prognosticating, all you're doing is you stop building up a huge edifice for which you are responsible, having built it. You've got to make the payments and all this jazz. Keep about because once you get involved in this game, everybody's trying to get it away from you. And a little pick here and a little pick here, there a pick, everywhere a pick. And you've got to watch out for all that stuff, or else you've got to have people help you watch out for it, or one thing and another. And this thing goes up. Because if you enjoy making a big show, that's all right. But if you find it becomes tiresome, to the extent that you're developing ulcers and grey hair and all the difficulties, it's not worth it. Go back to the natural life, where you don't, death is no problem, because when you die, you'll die. It'll be bang, like that. Instead of thinking, oh, what am I going to do when I die? What will it be like afterwards, and so on. All these absurd worries. You go along. And if there's an accident, if you didn't make the proper plans, phooey, it's finished. But better, you see, to go along one day without anxiety than thousands of days with anxiety all the time. That's the philosophy of nature, according to Lao Tzu. However, certain things must be remembered. Number one is that Zhuangzi in particular is given to exaggeration in his writings. You may have come across this in our culture, it's very common, that a certain group of people who have a certain set of ideas will often get together after a few drinks, and they will exaggerate their own philosophy, knowing very well that's what they're doing. I've heard, for example, among the clergy, when they get together, they think of all sorts of amazing schemes. One of them had the idea that he was going to, the Roman Catholic priests wear berettas. They're kind of black hats with blades on them and a pom-pom on top. And he was going to hang in his pulpit a beretta, and underneath that a set of false teeth that opened and closed while an electronic sermon was delivered. Well, in the same way about kind of spoofing about the thing that you are supposed to hold important and sacred. Zhuangzi spoofs about Taoism, and he makes it very, very exaggerated. So you've always got to allow for that, you see, in reading these texts, and think of the person who is perfectly natural, who may be depicted as somebody who absolutely is unwashed and covered in beards and does nothing whatever but just sits around and when it rains, he opens his mouth and gets a drink and that sort of thing. This is a symbol. The best of them all is this creature, Putai, in Japanese, Hote. He is immensely fat, and he carries in his hand a staff. It would be an elongated version of a staff like this. And he has also an immense bag in which he collects everything that is of unimportance and that has been discarded, and he gives it away to children. But this is the happy tramp, the old rogue, ideal of Taoist humor. Now, of course, you see there's an exaggeration. But if it is true, ultimately, that the Tao is that from which nothing can deviate, then it remains that the distinction between the artificial and the natural is an artificial distinction. Just as I showed you by our little science fiction episode this morning, that we are now at the point to which we could attain in any conceivable future. We're doing it already. All the things that we would then be doing in another way, but really essentially the same thing. So in a way, you can live a business life, a housewife's life, a professional life, and still be someone like Hote, Putai. But this requires some wisdom. First of all, now, let's get at that by going at it the other way round. I've described then what the West means by nature in a technical way, and I've described what the Chinese mean by nature in a poetic way. If all objects of art are natural, like bees' nests, how can we make a work of art look more natural than others? Or how can there be a kind of human behavior, if all human behavior is natural, that is somehow a greater approximation to naturalness than other people's behavior? This is done by a convention, which you might call sophisticated primitivity. Remember when I was explaining the language of Hinduism, I referred to a convention. All words are classifiers, and we understand them by contrast with other words as black and white, one and many. The Hindus needed a word for that which transcended all differentiation, and instead of calling it the one, they called it the non-dual, on the understanding that although the word non-dual has a logical opposite, namely dual, they were going to use that word as if it hadn't. And I used for that the illustration of our convention of perspective, that although we're drawing on a flat surface, we use lines in such a way as to mean that these lines are supposed to be taken as lines in the dimension of depth. So in exactly the same way, although everything is natural, there are certain art conventions which are understood by the culture to be more natural than anything else, to represent the spontaneous spirit. And this comes from two fundamental Taoist notions that are called respectively the uncarved block and the unbleached silk. Now you know when you wear a shirt made of unbleached silk, it has a nice kind of texture to it, like unbleached shantung. It has a kind of rough elegance to it. There's an art in Japan called bonseki, which means the cultivation of rocks. And the art of bonseki means to go around and find a rock that looks so much like a rock, more like a rock than other rocks. The mountain is the mountain, the water is the water. Now, I was talking this morning about Chinese ideas of the law of nature and showing that they didn't conceive nature as following laws, but that there nevertheless is in nature a principle of order that is wuzi, that is to say illegal, and yet orderly. And I tried to suggest the various ways in which we could somehow apprehend, and I use that word advisedly rather than comprehend, some way in which we can apprehend what they mean by order through this term li, which originally meant the markings in jade, the grain in wood, and the fiber in muscle. But that the principle of order in nature, the organic patterns in which nature plays, are never able to be completely reproduced in mechanical terms. And the reproduction of the patterns of physical nature in mechanical terms is what our forefathers meant by explanation in the West. Unless you could explain it in those terms, well, you hadn't really explained it. And so too, in the whole academic world of the West, that which cannot be written down and discussed in an accurate way is not matter for academic learning. This, of course, is a very limited point of view, because the world that can be described is never the same as the world that exists. The described world and the real world are incommensurable. And one must never lose sight of that. Otherwise you start eating the menu instead of the dinner and swallowing the money instead of what it can buy. And people characteristically do just that. So therefore, the people who have been hypnotized and bewitched by words have to be dehypnotized and come back to the world in which we live. Now you see, we call this world in which we live the physical world or the material world. And that bugs people who are what I call spiritual types. They want to find behind the material world, which changes and perishes, the spiritual world which is more real and which endures forever. But they get so fouled up because they're exactly backwards. The material world is a world of pure abstraction. Physical world, as we use this word, is a completely abstract creation. It is not concrete at all. That may surprise you, but a little investigation into the origin of words will show you conclusively that this is so. How does a scientist treat what he calls the material world? Answer: by quantitative methods. How do you establish quantity? By measure, by number, by representing nature in terms of abstract categories. Meters, inches, seconds, degrees, and so on. All of which are as abstract as the lines of latitude and longitude. And the word material goes back to the same word as meter, the metered world.
the measured or measurable world. And that in turn leads back to the Sanskrit word matra, that root from which we derive maya, or illusion. So, also, I explained to you when discussing nature that one of the great meanings of nature in the West is classification. What is the nature of this thing? In Greek, physis, hence our physics. Physis has to do then with the world as apprehended in a certain way. The world as apprehended according to its classes. And its classes are abstract. So actually, when we say of something, it is immaterial, it doesn't matter, that means it has no quantitative measure. It doesn't amount to anything. It doesn't add up to anything. It is unquantified. But at the same time, what we need in life is not so much quantity as quality. Mere quantity is absolutely abstract. But the quality, the essential taste, the flavor of life, the meaning of it, that's the important thing. There are ways of measuring qualities, but you always have to turn them into quantities. And say, well, the cook standing over the stew pot says, not quite enough salt. And so he puts in a little more and tastes again and says, now that's right. Now we could stand by somebody with a recording book and say, how many teaspoons did you finally put in? And now we've got the quantity in relation to how much pounds of actual stuff that you're cooking and so on. And we've got the quantitative abstraction corresponding to a taste experience, which is not an abstraction at all. So therefore, in order to bring a person back to the real world, you have to suspend temporarily, your abstract thinking. Because it is through abstracting that you divide everything up into differences, that you get the notion that you are one thing and I am another, that you get the notion that events are separate from each other. Events are separated in the same way as minutes are separated. And we try to draw the line separating 1 minute from another on our watch dials as finely as we can possibly draw it, because we want to know now is the time the minute turns to another one. And those lines, by their very thinness, show you how abstract they are, how tenuous, filmy, unreal. They're the measures. And don't confuse the measure with what is measured. The real world that can be seen and felt without abstraction is the world in which you are not different from everything that there is, from the Tao, from the whole course of nature. But you've been taught, you've been hoaxed and wangled by people who chattered and explained and had already hypnotized themselves into a view of the world which is quite abstract, quite arbitrary, not necessarily the way things are at all. So Taoism, in common with the Hindus and the Buddhists, is a great advocate of intellectual silence. Not, mind you, of saying that the intellect is a bad show and that one should be an anti-intellectual. Not at all. Thinking is just as much part of the process of nature as a spider weaving a web. The spider weaves the web to be a net for flies. The mind weaves a web, again the image of the lines of latitude and longitude, to be a net for catching the universe. And that is fine, it does it. But there is something other than a net for catching the universe. And in order to find it, you must temporarily stop using the net. Just in the same way as if you want to hear what other people have to say, you have to stop talking. If you want to talk, you must also know what you're talking about. In other words, if words represent the real world, you must be open to the real world in order to translate it effectively into words. But we are simply not taught to do that. Most of us think compulsively all the time. That is to say, we carry on a perpetual interior conversation, fearing that if that conversation were to cease, we would cease, and in a way we would. And so the Taoists speak constantly of being thoughtless, of having an empty mind, so that you can communicate with the real world without distortion. I've pointed out constantly in this seminar that the Taoists exaggerate. They overstress things they're talking about. And you must allow for that. And so, when they say that a certain wise man was so quiet and so still that moss grew over his body, and that animals crawled over him without noticing his presence, and that his breathing ceased altogether, that his heart no longer beat, they are using fanciful imagery. But quite definitely, in there is a Taoist yoga. There are Taoist meditation practices, just like Buddhist ones. And it is even conceivable that the Taoists were the first people to invent yoga and exported it from China to India. Some Indian scholars believe that this is so. So, the first element of Chinese Taoist yoga is to stop talking to yourself. Don't explain the world. This was in direct conflict with the Confucians, who made a great point of what Confucius himself, Kung Fu-Tzu is his proper name, called the rectification of names. Being sure that the language was in order, so that there wouldn't be confusion. But the Taoists said, how will you ever rectify names? You establish names by talking about them, and you explain them by talking about them. How will you then explain the words you use to talk about them and be sure they're fixed and in order, and so on? So, as Lao Tzu says, naming is the mother of the 10,000 things. He also says, no name, the nameless, is the origin of heaven and earth. So, one has to get to the nameless state, the non-thinking state, which is called in Chinese, Wu Nian. This Wu Nian, this character there, that far means now, and this means the heart-mind. when you put them together. Wu Nian means, Nian also translates remember. It also means equal to the Sanskrit word kshana. And kshana means an atom of time, a moment, an instant. See the world without dividing it into instants. Or see it all as one instant, not many instants in series. That's what this is. Now you will find, if you try, that it's a very difficult thing indeed to stop thinking. Doesn't mean you stop using your eyes and your ears and your hands and all your senses. But when you see a dog, don't say dog, but just see what's there. The Buddhists call this the state of suchness. Now you see, if I hold a conversation with somebody else, they hear my words and they get my meaning from the words. And we say, fine. What is the meaning of that situation? What is the meaning of the fact that I can convey something to you with words? Has no meaning at all. It's just something happening, like flowers go like this, the water goes blub, 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 and the wind goes whoo. See? So we are all sitting around here, listening to me talking. What does it mean? You know what I mean. But what does it mean that we're doing this? Look at it. You can see what it is. Well, just here we are, huh? Like that. And some people are watching baseball, and some people are watching television instead. Some people are sailing boats. Some people are traveling in airplanes. Some people are riding on buses. Some people are just picking their noses. But that, you see? Some people are playing music. And you know what that is? What's the meaning of music? Some music is made to have a meaning. It's what we call program music. You know, you hear all this, the cavalry is on the run. See? But when it's simply what the hell does that mean? It's just going along, see? It's marvelous. And the same way as the birds fly in the sky, and so on. What are they flying for? When the wind is high, you know, the gulls all go way up. And normally gulls are supposed to be busy fishing and surviving and doing the really important things. But there comes a wind and they all start floating up there on the wind. I don't know, maybe there's some insect or something up there thereafter, but I don't think so. I think they just like to float on the wind. And makes it much easier to fly. And so you can begin to see the world in that aspect. That then at once you begin to realize it simply isn't important whether you succeed or fail. These are arbitrary standards of the good imposed on the world in the same way as we impose our patterns and our measures. Whether it lasts a long time, that there is the light, or whether it's a short time, so what? There's a lovely Chinese poem that says, in the spring scenery, there is nothing superior, nothing inferior. Flowering branches grow of themselves, some short, some long. The morning glory blooms for an hour, and yet is no different from a giant pine that lives for 1,000 years. So that is the essential thing, to be able to see everything thus, because that's absolutely the root of Zen. And so when you truly see anything thus, silence. Lao Tzu said, those who know do not teach. Those who teach do not know. And yet he wrote the Tao Te Ching.
What an apology.
So I am teaching, but I'm also non-teaching, because I enjoy the sound of my own voice. And it is not a way of trying to tell you something. It is not a way of hoping that you will get a message in the ordinary sense of the word. But I am playing with words, and so the sound of my voice is a great deal more important than what I'm saying. Do you get that? I have a friend who tries to get people to listen. And while he's trying to get them to listen by talking, he says, now, don't try to attach any meaning to the sounds you hear, just hear them. Same way with my voice as you hear it explaining this to you now. And this is the entry into the real world, where there aren't any distinctions, because all the distinctions are made by thinking. Nor is there, for that matter, any sameness. It is just the way it is. And that's the Tao which can't be spoken. So you may ask me, how on earth do you get there? Because I think compulsively and I can't stop thinking. Well, the point is that you mustn't start by trying to banish thoughts from your mind. That is, as the Taoists say, beating a drum in search of a fugitive. Or it would be as if, supposing the police were suddenly to raid this place because they suspected we were running a tantric love cult, and that the cars, as they approached, had their sirens on. And everybody would hear the sirens and jump into their clothes and all start looking respectable. See? So, in the same way exactly, if you try to stop thinking, you are thinking about stopping thinking. And that creates a great battle and confusion. So what you have to do is to let your mind think whatever it likes to think. But as it does so, become aware of the words that are going through your mind as a form of lalling. Listen to what anybody is saying to you as a series of noises. We can do this very easily while listening to music. When you really listen to music, you don't talk. You just go with it. And that's why listening to music is a form of meditation. Especially music which doesn't try to make you think. Now, some people can't do that. Their music will simply stimulate ideas, and they will think about this and that and not listen. But if you really listen to music, the sound of it becomes your whole mind. And so it's more difficult to do this with the visual senses than with the auditory sense, because we think with our eyes to an amazing degree. But you soon can learn to look without interpreting what you're looking at. Doesn't mean you don't see, you look. But the world can begin to look very different indeed when you look without naming. And saying, that's a head, that's a face, that's hair, that's a hand. Because the moment you say it's a hand, you stop seeing the hand. Everybody has an abstract idea of a hand, sort of a five-fingered palm, you know. But you've never seen a hand. You really look at a hand, and you suddenly it stops being pink. All kinds of colors are there, and it becomes miraculous if you don't think about it. So, but as you cannot force non-thinking, you cannot force thoughts out of your mind. You simply listen to them in a new way and approach them in a new way. Thoughts are, as it were, unuttered noises in the head. See them that way. Words are vibrations in the air. Listen to them that way, as music. And slowly you begin to divest yourself of the interpretative system, the terminology, the value system in which you have been brought up to live as in a straitjacket.